Hey, what's up, guys? Simon Edwards at Pumacom with Heat Seeker Sports. And this is my first look at the NFL Week 5 slate. Literally my first look. I haven't even really dove into this too much other than getting my spreadsheet together. So I'm going to take a look at the DraftKings layout for this week. If you wouldn't mind, please give a like to this video and please subscribe to the YouTube page. Been given some really good nuggets, especially when it comes to Showdown. The past few weeks on Showdown have nailed a few game scripts, the most recently being this past Monday, where I nailed the Giants versus who'd they play? The Giants versus whoever the Giants played this week. And I called for Seattle. I called for a Seattle blowout of the Giants. And I was heavy on Seattle's defense. Didn't have them in the captain, unfortunately, but I nailed the game script regardless. And if you were watching that show, hopefully you made some money off of that projection. And the Jacksonville-Atlanta game on Sunday in London also hit on that game script. Didn't get the captain in that one. I had Bijan, heavy on Bijan, but I didn't have him in the captain. Ended up doubling my money on that slate, but not quite over the top because I didn't have Bijan and the captain in that one. But we're going to move on to this next slate. I'll be putting out a Thursday game script episode tomorrow where I'm going to analyze the Thursday night game. But for right now, let's take an early look at the Week 5 slate. Going to kind of go through these games as I'm looking at my my spreadsheet. So the Houston versus Atlanta game, that's kind of interesting to me. Houston has been playing really well this season so far, and I actually just bet on them. I got some pretty good odds. I think it was like plus 475 on DraftKings to win their division. If you look at Houston's schedule over the rest of the season, it's much easier than Jacksonville, and it's easier than Tennessee as well. So it sets up Houston to potentially make a run with their strength of schedule for the remainder of the season, and potentially take that division. I also like in that same division the Colts. I think the Colts have been really well coached this season, and they are clicking on all cylinders, and they got Anthony Richardson there, who's proven to be a stud as a quarterback. I think the Colts are really positioned well, and you can get them plus 500 on FanDuel to win the division. So we'll take a look at Houston's matchup here. It's a 41.5 total, so that's not very good, but somehow Houston are the dogs in this game, I guess, and they're playing in Atlanta. So looking through this, I think the tight end has a good matchup for Houston, but Dalton Schultz has really not done too much so far this season. Let's take a look at Dalton Schultz. What's Dalton Schultz done so far this season? He's 3,400, so that's a little bit on the pricey side. He got 13.2 points this past week in Week 4. He only got 3 targets. He hasn't been getting many targets. Not as many targets as you would expect tight end on a team with a rookie quarterback to be racking up. He's had 3. He had 7 in Week 2, but he only scored 7 fantasy points off that, and then he had 4 with Baltimore. So this could be a breakout week for Dalton Schultz, but given the total on this game and given his performance so far this season, I'm not really into Dalton Schultz. The other area of interest in this game is going to be Bijan. He's got a really good matchup against the Houston run D, and Bijan is in a matchup where the Houston's been giving up 27 points, DraftKings points per game to running backs. So I would expect Bijan to be pretty chalky this week. But if you get any sort of a discount on Bijan's ownership, I think Bijan is definitely someone that you're going to want to take a hard look on to get in your lineups this week. And other than that, I think Tank Dell, from a DVOA perspective, looks like he's got a pretty nice matchup this week too. So look for him to continue to roll. How many targets did Tank Dell get this past week? He had another big week. This guy's been on fire. And this is like what I'm talking about with Houston. They have all these young players that are just like really good. CJ Stroud's been good. Tank Dell's been good. They get more tape on Tank Dell. So, he's probably not going to keep it up like the entire season. But so far this season, he's been really good. He only got 3 targets against Pittsburgh. Not sure. It looks like they had a huge lead, so that would explain why he wasn't too involved against Pittsburgh this past week. He only got 3 targets. He got 7 targets against Jacksonville and 10 targets against Indy. Versus Indy, he scored 20 fantasy points, and versus Jacksonville, he had 28.5 fantasy points. So Tank Dell is a dude that you're going to want to keep your mind on this week. He looks like he's got a decent DVOA matchup in this game. So moving on to the next game, I don't really have any interest in too many other guys in that Atlanta-Houston game, just based on the total. Maybe that'll change later on in the week when I do a little bit more research. But for now, I'm not really into a game stack there. Next, we got Carolina versus Detroit. A lot of word in Carolina that they're hunting for a wide receiver 1 to help out the rookie Bryce Young over there, the rookie quarterback. But honestly, like with the veterans they got, Adam Thielen and DJ Chark have proven that they've been doing well this season. It's just Bryce Young needs to be a better quarterback to use them better. Because we saw what Andy Dalton did. Andy Dalton exploded with these guys. Look at Adam Thielen's numbers. When he was in that game with Andy Dalton, he had 34.5 points. He had 15 points last week. He had 20 points in week 2, where our guy Spread called him as the captain in his matchup against New Orleans, and he ended up putting up the captain number, and the winning Millie lineup or whatever the big contest was for that week ended up with Adam Thielen in the captain. Another reason you want to watch Game Script, I'll have Spread on again, I believe for the London show, and we're going to record that on Friday. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, Thielen's been doing really good this year. 9 targets, 14 targets, 8 targets last week. 14 targets was with Andy Dalton, and we were targeting that Seattle defense because Seattle's got a really bad wide receiver receiving defense. So Adam Thielen has definitely been having a good season, and DJ Chark has been doing well, or at least he did well with Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton gave him 11 targets, and he scored 18.6 fantasy points. But look at these numbers with Bryce Young, like 1 target for 15 yards, 3 targets for 28 yards. Like Bryce Young just is not getting it done. He's not been a very good quarterback. And you can tell, like when you compare him to veteran Andy Dalton, that was part of the reason why we played those stacks. He was a featured stack in my Ugly Stack show in week 3 against Seattle, just specifically because of the matchup, but also because of the veteran presence of Andy Dalton. I thought would elevate these veteran wide receivers, having a guy who knows how to read defenses throwing to them. Bryce Young has not been good at that, and this Detroit defense has been pretty good this season. They're playing at Detroit. That's one thing that they got going for them, is they're playing in a dome, but I don't know how much I'm going to be investing in this game. Let's see what the spread is on this. It's got a decent total at 45 points. Detroit projected to score 26.75 points, 8.5 point spread. So Detroit is heavy favorites in this game at home against Carolina, and you would expect them to have a pretty easy go against Carolina's defense. Carolina's defense is giving up almost 32 DraftKings points a game to the running back position. So that sets up David Montgomery really well in this game. I'm done with Gibbs, man. I'm done with Gibbs until he shows something. He's been absolutely useless every time I've started him, and I'm sick of recommending this guy. He had 8 attempts last week, but he also had 5 targets 4 receptions on those targets. He had 17 attempts the prior week when David Montgomery was out, and he put up 9 fantasy points. So his best game so far this season is 12.6 fantasy points. He's going to have a big game eventually, but like so far he hasn't shown anything, and I'm done with Jahmyr Gibbs for now. David Montgomery, on the other hand, has been having a decent season. He put up 37 points against a bad Green Bay run D. I expect him to be able to do something similar against Carolina's run D. So we'll see how that plays out. But David Montgomery, he might be a guy who's chalky this week, unless people still think that Jahmyr Gibbs can keep that keep that work away from him, and it keeps his ownership down a little bit. But David Montgomery, keep an eye on him and monitor what his ownership's going to be. Seattle, Montgomery had 16 carries for 13 fantasy points, 67 yards in that. And versus Kansas City, 21 carries for 13 and a half fantasy points. So it hasn't been too impressive. He finally had his breakout week, but it took him 32 attempts. I'm guessing that he's going to have close to that. Like if Carolina, like I just don't have any faith in Bryce Young as a quarterback right now in his rookie season. Like the team is like I said, they're trying to bring in another number 1 wide receiver, but it's not the receivers that are the problem in that offense. So they are struggling, and I would look for David Montgomery to have a big game in that matchup. As far as other guys, wide receiver has a good matchup against Carolina. Carolina, they've been putting up points against them. So I'm not sure who would have the best matchup here. It looks like Amon-Ra probably has, he doesn't have a very good matchup because they're not letting a lot of points to the slot. But maybe Josh Reynolds. Josh Reynolds might be a sneaky guy in this game if you need a pivot off of Amon-Ra. But Amon-Ra, he can play out wide too. So maybe Amon-Ra, gets enough reps out of the slot to have a decent game. But he would not be on the top of my premium wide receiver list this week. In addition to that, Carolina is Detroit is giving up about 17 points a game to the tight end. With Carolina, I don't even know if they have a decent tight end, really. They got Hayden Hurst. What's Hayden Hurst done? Hayden Hurst has put up 1.7 fantasy points last week, 2 points with Andy Dalton, put up 5 points against New Orleans and 15 fantasy points against Atlanta. And his targets, he's only gotten about 3 targets a week, except for that week 1 game where he got 7 targets. So not too much interest in Hayden Hurst this week, despite the good matchup, and probably won't go too deep into this game as far as looking for fantasy goodness. So let's get rid of this game. Moving on to the next one. We got Tennessee versus Indy. This game sounds a little bit interesting because we got Anthony Richardson again. Not a great matchup against the run D of Tennessee, but let's see how they've done if they've played anyone that would be a running quarterback. They played against Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson put up big numbers against them in week 3. So there is potential for Richardson to have a good game, and that's all we're looking for with Anthony Richardson. We just want that potential because he's been on fire this season, and Tennessee is a tough matchup, but if Anthony Richardson is showing us any type of, any type of low ownership this week, I think he's a guy that we're going to want to try to target. Tennessee has not been giving up a ton of points to the quarterback position, 17.5 fantasy points a game, DraftKings points a game, but they've been giving it up to wide receivers. So maybe this is a game where we see the wide receivers on the Colts kind of start to open up a bit. Michael Pittman, he's had a good week. A couple weeks ago, he scored 16.5 fantasy points against Baltimore. Week 1, he had 23.5 against Jacksonville. I would probably project him to score between 16 to 23 points in a game like this, in a matchup like this. Last week, he only had 5 targets, but prior weeks, he had 11, 12, and 11 targets. So don't be surprised to see Michael Pittman with a big game this week. Other than that, with Tennessee, the slot receivers versus this Indy defense have done well. That puts Nick Westbrook-Ikhine on the radar. Let's take a look at him. What has he done so far this year? Nick Westbrook-Ikhine had a big game last week. He scored 16 fantasy points against Cincy, and his salary was only $3,300. So you got a decent return there. A few weeks ago against the Chargers, he scored 11 fantasy points, so not much to write home about there. He's only $3,500 this week, and he's got a really good matchup, so I wouldn't write him off this week, especially if that game ends up being like one where Tennessee is going to need to throw a decent amount. So keep an eye on Nick Westbrook-Ikhine for this week's matchup. Looks like Indy's got a tough running back matchup, but I'm not really interested in the running backs in Indy. Jonathan Taylor has been back in practice this week, so we don't know, when exactly he's going to be officially on the roster again. But they activated him from the PUP, and I believe that, or from IR, and I believe they have a 21-day window to make him officially active. So I would not be surprised if Jonathan Taylor is active. He's probably watching his team get these wins and watching the coach lead this team to these wins, and he's probably thinking to himself, "I got to get in on this. I'm in a contract year potentially. I got to start, getting some tape in there before they take the running back job away from me, because Zach Moss has been doing a pretty good job in running back so far without him." And Zach Moss last week, what did he do? He only got 9 fantasy points last week. That's kind of what I projected with Anthony Richardson coming back. He got 25 weeks prior to that with Gardner Minshew in there. And then he got 20 weeks when the week where Anthony Richardson went down. So Zach Moss, not really used in the running game, even as a lead runner when you got Anthony Richardson in there, because Anthony Richardson is doing a ton of running himself. Last week, Richardson, once again, 30 fantasy points, 17 fantasy points. That was in one quarter in week 2 before he got hurt. And then the week before that, 21, 22 fantasy points. He's only $7,000. Where does that put him relative to the rest of the field? That makes him fifth highest expense. So his price is getting up there. He's getting to the point now where you have to actually think about plugging him in. But he's been a no-brainer every start that he's had so far this season. So Anthony Richardson, always a guy to be interested in there. As far as other wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins might have a good matchup here, because Tennessee, Indy's giving up 17 points a game to wide receiver. That puts Hopkins right in the mix, especially if this ends up being more of a back and forth. Although Derrick Henry does not have a bad matchup with Indy giving up 23 points a game to the running back position. Maybe go back and look at his history against Indy's run defense to get a better idea of what his history is there. As far as wide receivers on the Indy side, Michael Pittman, we already talked about. Alec Pierce, not too interested there. He's going to have a breakout game eventually, but Josh Downs has an interesting matchup, because Tennessee is giving up 25 to almost 26 points a game, DraftKings points a game, to slot receivers. And Josh Downs is running 90% of his routes in the slot, or he's lining up at least 90% of the time in the slot. So Josh Downs is interesting. Let's see what he's done so far this season. Josh Downs, $3,700. His game log, what kind of targets is he getting? He got 3 targets last week. He got 12 targets against Baltimore. He got 12 targets against Baltimore. He got 5 targets against Houston and 7 targets against Jackson. So he's been getting work apart from last week, where it didn't look like any of these receivers got much work done. But in this matchup with a guy who's been getting like 12, 5, and 7 targets, he could be interesting. He hasn't done anything with those targets. He's only scored max of 13 and a half fantasy points pretty much, but he's 3,700, and Josh Downs is a guy that you might want to have on your short list of sneaky guys to keep an eye on this week. So other than that, let's move on to the next game. Let's see. New York versus Miami. The Giants are an absolute dumpster fire. I projected Seattle to blow them out this past week, and they delivered. New York scored 3 points total. Like, their offensive line is a mess. They were on their 4th iteration of the offensive line, leaving up plenty of room for Seattle's defense for sacks and interceptions. They called a pick 6 on him. And now he's facing Miami. Miami's going to blow him out. I would be focused on Miami's run game in this, because I don't think that the Giants are going to be able to put up a fight. Like, Daniel Jones looks lost. As I mentioned, their offensive line is a disaster. Daniel Jones is 1-6 in primetime games, so maybe he's got a little bit of primetime Danny Dimes going on. But, like, as far as New York goes, Miami is allowing 23 points per game to quarterback. So if you want to go contrarian, like, or like, maybe go back to that Danny Dimes, well, he might be worth looking at. But, like, I really, struggle to do that the way that they've looked and the way that O-line is protecting him right now. As far as running back, it looks like Saquon Barkley was at practice, I believe, today. So Saquon was doubtful and out of the pass game, but maybe this game he actually makes it back. We've been hearing mixed thoughts on his ankle, whether or not it's a high ankle sprain or, like something, something lesser than that. But looks like he's went from being out a few weeks ago to being day-to-day. Then he was doubtful yesterday for this past game, and he ended up being out. But I'm not sure what his status is this week. But he's got a good matchup against this Miami D, who's giving up 25 fantasy points a game to running back. So Saquon Barkley would be interesting in this matchup. The Dolphins are 10.5-point favorites in this, which, isn't great, but they got a high total, 49.5 points. So Giants will be playing from behind. Saquon Barkley is pretty much matchup proof. As far as wide receivers, Jalen Hyatt looks like he has a decent matchup, and Darius Slayton as well. Depends on what you think about these Giants. I don't think I would necessarily want to go there just because of how bad they've looked, but Miami's given up 18.5 points to wide receivers, and we know that the Giants are going to be playing from behind most likely in this game. So as far as what those guys have done, let's see. Let's take a look at what Darius Slayton has done. He did nothing as we projected in this past game, only 3 targets, 6 targets the week prior to that against San Francisco, and 6 and 5 in those weeks prior to that. Highest fantasy total on the year is 9.2 points. So really just not interested in these Giants receivers. Although if you can get some salary relief, would it be worth it? Let's see. Hyatt is 3,600. Hyatt got 2 targets last week. The week that I recommended him against San Francisco, he got 0 targets after having that big performance against Arizona where he got like 2 receptions for 89 yards. Looked like he was going to break out. The Giants would start using him, but the Giants are clueless. They don't know what they're doing. So I just don't have any interest in the Giants. I actually like the Miami D a little bit in this game, but I could see the Giants with the weaknesses that Miami has against quarterback, running back, and basically everybody. Like I could see the Giants actually putting up some points, but I don't think that they will be in contention to win the game. Also for the Giants, they got a good matchup with tight end with Darren Waller. Waller is the same story. He hasn't done anything this year. I recommended him on the Monday slate, and that burned me because I had too much exposure to him. He got 3 targets against Seattle. He got 7 targets the week before that, 8 targets the week before that, and 5. So he's getting the targets, but the highest fantasy output he's had is 13.5 points. So Waller is not working in New York so far this season, but he could break out any week. Maybe this is the week, but I would look more towards like a Wan'Dale Robinson, although it doesn't look like he's got a very good matchup. So I would probably pass on him. But Wan'Dale Robinson has been getting targeted when he's on the field. He got 6 targets this past week, and he got 5 the week before that. So Wan'Dale is eventually going to be a guy that we're going to be interested in, but I'm not too interested in him against this Miami Dolphins. Who I am interested in on the Miami Dolphins is the running backs. They've been on fire lately, and New York's giving up 27 points a game to the running back position. That's why we targeted Kenneth Gainwell in this past Monday's game. So A-Chain has been on fire. A-Chain got another 8 attempts for 101 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns this past week against Buffalo, put up 30 DraftKings points. And how did Mostert do? Mostert got he got 7 attempts for 9 yards and 6.5 fantasy points. But Mostert in his previous weeks, 45 fantasy points, 28.7 DraftKings points, and 13. So Mostert's been really good this season. But with Mostert, we never know, when he's going to get hurt. And that leaves an interesting dilemma with A-Chain. A-Chain only had 8 attempts. He got about half the attempts last week. Looks like they're in a pretty even timeshare. A-Chain also had 5 targets last week. How many targets did Mostert have last week? Mostert had 5 targets as well. So it's pretty much a dead even timeshare. So if A-Chain is low on the ownership projection this week, he will be interesting. As far as prices, 6,200 and 6,100 between the two of them. So, if you're going to start a Miami running back, they're the same price. They're getting the same opportunity. They're putting out about the same the same fantasy points. I would just go with the guy who's going to be an ownership discount on between the two of those guys. If Mostert is going to be significantly less owned because A-Chain's been getting a bunch of hype, then Mostert would be the way to go in this if you're going to go with just one Miami running back. But, with New York giving up 27 points a game to the position, and Miami being 10.5 point favorites, it could be both of those guys. But, we'll have to see what the other running back matchups look like this week. It looks like we got some other ones, so it probably wouldn't be both of them. But, yeah, that's definitely Miami running game. Just going to have to do some more research throughout the week to see which one of those guys I would rather have in my lineups. So other than that, that covers basically all the positions between those two teams. So let's move on to the next game. Going to New Orleans versus New England. This is going to be an interesting game. New Orleans, Kamara came back last week. What did he do last week? Kamara came back last week. He put up 21.5 fantasy points against Tampa Bay, who traditionally has had a good run defense, but maybe not as good this year. But Tampa Bay is a pretty tough run D to be putting up 21.5 points in your first game of the season. So that makes him interesting there. As far as New Orleans versus New England's matchup, the only thing that stands out really is wide receiver for the Saints, which puts Chris Olave on our targets, on our radar, and Rashid Shaheed, who has not done too much recently, but he's the type of guy that you want to look at when he is not getting a lot of attention, especially at that $3,800 price tag. But the total in this game is a little too low to focus on wide receivers. It's a 40.5 total with the Patriots as 1.5 favorites. So if that game would end up being a back and forth affair, with it being so close, maybe that total is a little bit low. We know that New England just lost one of its top cornerbacks, but they also just traded for J.C. Jackson of the Chargers, so they're getting J.C. Jackson back in New England. But it'll probably take a little bit to integrate him into the offense. But definitely going to take a harder look at that game. Mac Jones got pulled in this past week too. So yeah, there's a lot of issues going on in New England right now. So the only side I'd be interested in here would be one of those New Orleans receivers potentially, but with a 40.5 total, I probably wouldn't be interested in any of those guys, to be honest. So we can take a look real quick about what those guys have done. Let's see. Shaheed, what did he do recently? He got 7 targets last week, 2 targets a week before that, 4 targets a week before that, and 6 targets a week before that. I can't remember if Derek Carr was in the game this past week. If he was hurt. Let's take a look. Was it Winston last week, or was it? Yeah, it looks like Derek Carr did play last week. Did not do very good in that matchup against Tampa Bay. But, with Kamara back, they were probably leaning more on Kamara than anything else. But in general, like, Derek Carr has only had 1 game with over double-digit fantasy points, so he's been horrible this season, like a horrible fantasy asset. So not interested in really any of the Saints, but keep Shaheed on your radar and always have Olave on your radar, because he's a guy that could go off at any time. He's put up 1.4 fantasy points last week. Before that, he did 21. He had 14.5, and then he had 22. So definitely always going to have some interest in Olave, especially in a matchup where the opposing defense is giving up 21 points a game to wide receiver. But Olave could be the guy that they decide to shut down in New England. So, yeah, going to move on from that game. Let's look at Baltimore versus Pittsburgh. Kenny Pickett went down with a knee injury this past game, but it looks like it wasn't as serious as it looked. So we're keeping an eye on him to see when he's going to be healthy again. But the total in this game is the lowest total on the slate. It's a 38.5 point total, with Baltimore's 3.5 point favorites. Where are they playing? They're playing in Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh is a dog at home. Those are the kind of spots that we like Pittsburgh in, but I think this total is just too low. And we got Baltimore projected, Pittsburgh's given up 27 points, DraftKings points per game to running back, but Baltimore has no decent running backs. It's all a bunch of scrubs. So as home favorites, what did Gus Edwards do last week? He had 15 attempts against Cleveland, 6.9 fantasy points, 5 fantasy points. He hasn't had a big week. Justice Hill looked like he was going to have a decent season, and then he got hurt in the first week, so he hasn't done anything since. 13 fantasy points, 8 fantasy. So not really interested in this Baltimore running game, other than, like maybe Lamar Jackson, but like Pittsburgh isn't allowing a whole bunch of fantasy points to the quarterback position. So maybe just a pass on that. As far as slot receivers, Pittsburgh's giving up 32.5 points per game to slot receiver. That makes, I think Zay Flowers would probably be the most interesting, with running 31% of his routes from the slot. 32.5 points. What has Zay Flowers done so far this season? Zay Flowers last week, 8 points. The week before that, he put up 13, he put up 11, and then he put up 18. So he got 4 targets last week, 10 targets in week 3, 5 in week 2, and 10 in week 1. He's had a couple 10-target weeks. They've manufactured a lot of plays towards his strengths. So, don't be surprised to see Zay Flowers have a decent game in this matchup if they get him matched up in the slot like a decent amount in this matchup. So Zay Flowers is a guy, probably the only guy I would keep in my radar from this game. So let's see. Moving on to the next game, we got Cincinnati, Arizona. This is a game that I actually like. So let's look a little bit more at this game. Let's see. Arizona has been playing pretty hard so far this season. You can tell that they are being coached well. They're outperforming like what expectations were of them. They got a nice rookie receiver in Mike Wilson. Then they got Marquise Brown, who's always been a good receiver, and they just have weapons. They have weapons, and Josh Downs has been doing pretty good too as a quarterback. Josh Dobbs. So what has he done so far this season? Look at the points that Josh Dobbs is putting up. He put up 23.5 points against San Francisco. He put up 17 points against Dallas. He put up 25 points against the Giants. This is a dude who is having a really good year. He finally gets in the spot, where he's got opportunity, but he's also got coaching. He's kind of been a journeyman from what I remember of this guy. He's very interesting in this matchup at 5,200 in a game with a 44.5 point total. With Arizona has been outperforming. Let's see what the scores were in these games. Arizona put up 16 points versus Washington. That was a weak game. They put up 28 points against the Giants. They put up 28 points against Dallas, and they put up 16 points against San Francisco. But he put up 23 fantasy points against the San Francisco defense, and now he gets Cincinnati's defense. Cincinnati's defense is giving up about 18 points a game to the quarterback position. They're giving up 22 points a game to running back. They've got a good defensive coordinator over in Cincinnati, but they are playing in Arizona this week. This game is definitely interesting to me, especially if Joe Burrow starts to come alive this week. They continue to I don't know if they're keeping him off the injury report, but yeah, Joe Burrow should be able to get it together here soon. I would rather be ahead of that curve as opposed to behind that curve. That's why I don't mind, playing Joe Burrow week in and week out as his price continues to plummet. It's at 6,200 this week. Joe Burrow was at, where was he last week? Last week he was 65, and then he was 65 in week 3, 69 in week 2, 7,100 in week 1. So his salary has been slowly declining, and that Joe Burrow is going to break out of this slump eventually. Obviously, he has that calf injury. Looked like he hurt his shoulder in this past week's game, so keep an eye on the injury report there. But yeah, Joe Burrow is eventually going to have a big game. He's indoors in this game against Arizona, and Arizona is giving up 22 fantasy points a game, DraftKings points a game to quarterback. They're giving up 33.5 DK points a game to running back. So don't be surprised to see Joe Mixon as a popular option as a running back this week. But Joe Burrow could be interesting because if Arizona is able to put up a fight in this game, which they've shown that they're capable of doing, Joe Burrow hasn't done anything this year. They did 3 points in week 1, 16 points in week 2, 9 points in week 3, and 5 points. So, Joe Burrow is just that injury must be really worse than what they're leading on. Mixon, what's Mixon done? Mixon's 10 points in week 1, 13.5 in week 2, 14 in week 3. I think we used him as the captain in week 2 versus ball. No, we used him in the captain in week 3 versus the Rams, and he ended up scoring 14 points. And then he scored 8.6 points in week 4. So Joe Mixon, not really. He's kind of underwhelming this year, but he gets probably his best matchup of the year against Arizona's run defense, which is allowing 33.5 DraftKings points a game to that running back position. From the Arizona side, Cincinnati's only giving up 18 points a game. Now, not only is this a 44.5 total, but it's a 3-point spread with Cincinnati being the favorites. So that makes Arizona the the home dogs in a game where they've been playing well. And, Cincinnati has not been playing very well, but Cincinnati has the firepower to put up points. Like, this is a game that I'm interested in this week. Going to look a little bit deeper into it. Looks like T. Higgins has a decent matchup, although I think T. Higgins is hurt, so I'm not sure what T. Higgins' status is. He's questionable for this week. He's not practicing on Wednesday, so he hasn't practiced yet this week. Just not sure what is going on with T. Higgins, but if he's out, that makes Jamar Chase all the more interesting. Jamar Chase, 14 fantasy points last week, 29 the week before that, 8 the week before that, and 9 the week before that. They've been putting him on all these low A dot passes near the line of scrimmage, trying to protect Joe Burrow a little bit. The Cincinnati offensive line has been a disaster again this year. They cannot get that offensive line together. Hopefully, they're able to come through for them this week. Unfortunately, with that matchup being so good for the Cincinnati running back, that's the only thing that kills me in this matchup. If I was stacking this game, I'd probably stack the Arizona side and maybe run it back with Mixon or run it back with Chase, or maybe Mixon and Chase, depending on how much work we think Chase is going to get. He's got a really good matchup against Arizona. So yeah, I do like Chase this week. So yeah, keep him in mind for sure, and keep this game on your radar. This might be a ugly stack type of game. So moving on to the next game, Philadelphia versus the Rams. Let's see what we got going on here. The Rams are another team, man. The Rams are plus 1,700 to win their division, and the Rams have looked good, and they're getting Cooper Kupp back. So Matt Stafford's going to have two weapons in Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp, and then he's got Tutu Atwell, who's been playing well this year too. This week, the total is 50.5 points. They got a 4.5-point favorites are Philly. They're playing in Los Angeles. I've been calling it with Philly for a while now. How I don't think that they have a very good coaching staff. Now that they lost their OC and DC from last year, they're all in different teams doing well. One for Arizona and the Colts. So I think those guys are the ones who made the wheels run the engine run last year for last couple years for Philadelphia, and really turned Jalen Hurts into a star. And now Nick Sirianni is out there on his own trying to get it done. And the OC does not look good in Philly. They barely won last week. They barely beat Washington last week. They've had a couple close games this season. They're primed for an upset, and I would not be surprised if it happens in Los Angeles this week. Matt Stafford has a good matchup. Philly's given up 22.5 points to the quarterback position. Philly seems to be a run pass funnel defense this year because they're only giving up 13.5 to running back. They're giving up 21.6 to wideouts, and they're giving up 26.1 to slot receivers. and they're giving it up 16 points a game to tight end. So the defense is not doing very well as far as fantasy points are concerned for Philly this season. Let's take a look at that a little bit harder. Like with Jalen Hurts, like he's been struggling. He had his first like decent passing game this past week, put up 319 yards versus Washington, 2 touchdowns through the air, and rushing. This is the first week that his passing was better than his rushing. So he's been struggling a little bit. He's been, prior to last week, was getting all his fantasy points from tush pushes, which is, like if you get fantasy points through that, like all power to you. But without the tush push in week 3, you can knock 6 points off that 22 points. So he would have gotten 16 points in week 3 against Tampa Bay, and he would have lost 14 points against Minnesota. So he only would have gotten 12 fantasy points against Minnesota without those 1-yard touchdowns. So Jalen Hurts, he's been struggling a little bit with putting up the stats, but he did have a good week last week against Washington's secondary. So Jalen Hurts, always going to be interesting, especially in a total like this. We're looking at that 50.5 point total. Rams only giving up 15.5 fantasy points to that quarterback position. So he's got a difficult, like a little middling matchup as far as the quarterback position. But he is going against a good coach in McVay, and their team is solid. They got decent pieces of their defense. The defense has been stepping up this season. Let's look at how the defense has been doing for the Rams. I'm not considering the defense against the Eagles, but they have given up 23 points against Indy. They gave up 19 points against Cincy. San Francisco is where they struggled. They gave up 30 points, and they gave up 13 points against Seattle. So their defense has been pretty good this year. So that makes the matchup even more difficult for Jalen Hurts and sets up the Rams to be in an upset position with Matt Stafford having a good matchup. 22.5 fantasy points is what the Eagles are giving up to the quarterback position. Matt Stafford, so far this season, 20 points last week, 13 points the week before that, 19 points the week before that, 17 points the week before that. So he hasn't been great. So I probably wouldn't be looking too hard at Matthew Stafford this week. Although I do like that, like the run game will likely be shut down against Philly, and that's going to force him to pass. And that puts Puka Nacua, with Philly giving up 21.5 fantasy points, DraftKings points per game to wideouts, and 26 DK points a game to slots. That makes Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell both interesting to me this week. Puts Van Jefferson on the radar too. Let's take a look at those guys. Puka Nacua continues to do well. He had another big week this past week. 10 targets, 34 fantasy points, DraftKings points. 7 targets the week before that, 12 DraftKings points. 20 targets in week 2 against San Francisco, put up 33 fantasy points. 15 targets in week 1, 25 fantasy points. So Puka Nacua is almost he's probably my favorite wide receiver of the week based on this matchup. Tutu Atwell, what has he done? Tutu Atwell put up only 7 points last week, but prior to that, he put up 17 points, 15 points, and 20 points. So if you're going to use Matt Stafford this week, this is the week to double stack him against Philly. And you might even like one way you could go this week is put Jalen Hurts and double stack Jalen Hurts with a couple of those Rams receivers. Because if Jalen Hurts ends up having to run a lot in this game, with Los Angeles is only giving up 11.8 points to wideouts, and they're giving up 15.5 points to slot. That's among the lowest in the league, so they're doing really well. The Rams defense, so not great matchups for these Philly receivers. So it's gonna be interesting there. Like keep an eye on that game. That's gonna be a game to target depending on ownership. We got to keep an eye on what the ownership is going to do this week. Denver versus the Jets. I mean, this is about as good a get right spot as you can get for Zach Wilson. He finally gets an easy matchup. He's had a lot of pressure on him. Like Denver is giving up 27 points per game to the quarterback position. New York is 2.5-point dogs against Denver, playing in Denver. Just all around, the Denver defense has given up points, just like horrible defense this season. 26.8 points to the quarterback, 45.5 to running back, 20.8 to wideouts, 24.5 to slot, 15 to tight end. Take your pick on the ways that the Jets can attack. They'll most likely go to the run game, where Breece Hall has just been called by his coach as having no more limitations, no more snap counts on Breece Hall. Look for this game to be Breece Hall's breakout game. Not sure what the ownership's going to be. Hopefully it'll be low, but Breece Hall is 5,400. That seems pretty cheap to me for running back. Where does that put him relative to the slate though? Running back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. He's way down there. Breece Hall is a lock this week against Denver. Yeah, Breece Hall is in a really good situation. He's probably going to be way too chalky, but if you get any indication that he's not going to be chalky, then Breece Hall is going to be he's going to be a great play this week. Wide receivers, Garrett Wilson. This could be the Garrett Wilson week. If New York is playing from behind like it's projected, this could be a Garrett Wilson week. What's he been doing? Garrett Wilson has been, 15 fantasy points in week 4, 9 or 10 fantasy points a week before that, 16 before that, 14 before that. Garrett Wilson has had big games with Zach Wilson in the past. That's the reason. There's a reason he won Rookie of the Year, because he was able to pull off games. Don't be surprised if Garrett Wilson has a good game this week against that Denver secondary. Let's see. Let's make sure there's no injury report on him. Yeah, he's going to be getting targeted too. Look at his targets. He got 14 targets last week, 9 targets a week before that, 8 targets a week before that. Zach Wilson played really well against the Chiefs, who are a tough defense, a much tougher defense than Denver. Don't be surprised to see the Jets have a decent offensive performance this week. This game could potentially, I'd say go over the total, but the Jets defense is too tough for this Denver team. So, depending on if Denver's able to put up points, I like the Jets to win this game though, and I like the Jets offense to look decent this week. So keep them in mind. Who else could we look at from the Jets? We can look at. I don't have any interest in Randall Cobb or Alan Lazard. So yeah, that puts Garrett Wilson as the only guy I have. Oh, Tyler Conklin. Broncos giving up 15 points per game to the tight end position. What's Tyler Conklin been doing? Tyler Conklin. Let's see. Get that game highlighted again. Tyler Conklin put up 6 targets last week, 5 targets the week before that. 6. He's getting the targets. He only put up 10 fantasy points in week 2, 5 in week 3, and only 10 last week. So he hasn't been putting up the points, but he's been getting the targets. And now he has a pretty decent matchup against Denver. Yeah, I was trying to see if he was playing any tough. He hasn't really had any too difficult matchups. So Yeah, Conklin just has been underperforming this year. So yeah, I'd probably focus on Garrett Wilson and Brees Hall in this matchup. Those are the guys that I'm most interested in against the Broncos. Broncos side, yeah, Jets have actually been giving up points to the running back position. We saw our guy Javonte Williams. I recommended him last week, and of course, he got hurt. That's been happening. That happens a lot with guys that I recommend. They end up getting hurt on the first series of the game. But Javonte Williams last week, we won't look at last week. The week before that, he had 11 attempts. He had 12 before that and 13. They want to use Javonte in a featured role, but they just haven't been able to because they lost 20-70 against Miami. The Washington game would have been a good opportunity, but looks like they really just didn't use him. But he was fresher off of injury, obviously, in week 2. It's probably going to take him a half a season to, get going again. But against the Vegas, he got 13 attempts for 10. Like he just has not done anything this year. McLaughlin's the guy who filled in for him last week. McLaughlin, 7 attempts, 72 yards, put up 19.5 fantasy points. That's the week that we should have gotten out of Javonte last week. Wasn't the case because Javonte went out like in the first, series of the game pretty much. So Javonte, keep an eye on his injury status. If he ends up playing, he suffered a hip flexor. He's questionable for this week. I heard it wasn't serious, but if he's out, then McLaughlin will be a good run back option for your Jets plays. But if you're playing Brees Hall, I wouldn't play necessarily McLaughlin as a run back against him. Next game, let's take a look at the Denver tight end has a good matchup, but Denver's got no tight ends. They got Troutman, who has been dust, and Dulcich has been hurt. So we got nothing there. Final game, Kansas City versus Minnesota. Let's take a look at this game. This is the game of the week from a chalk perspective. You look at what Kansas City is giving up, though. They're playing in Minnesota, so Cousins has that working for him. Kansas City's only given up 14 points per game to the quarterback position. They've been a good defense this week. And this is why what makes Zach Wilson's performance all the more impressive is that he put up his best game again of the season against a tough Kansas City defense. Kansas City's only allowing 15 points a game to the running back position. This is a game that could be built up like with his high total, 53.5 point total. But the matchup on Minnesota's side really isn't that good. Like you could see potentially Kansas City, taking a lead in this one and just kind of just being a slow, like sluggish kind of game where we're expecting firepower, but they're not delivering. Like Kansas City has the best matchup in the wide receiver spot with Minnesota giving up 30 points a game to wide receivers, to wideouts. And look at the wideouts on Kansas City, though. Do you want to? I don't want to start MVS Sky. I don't want to have to pick between these scrubs. So there's really no one to pick from. Like Kadarius Toney, maybe take a dart throw on him. What have these guys been even doing this year? We faded all of them like this past game. Ended up working, but 2 targets last week against the Jets, 6 targets for Sky Moore against Chicago. Biggest fantasy output is 16 points in week 2. That's not going to be enough to get it done. Kadarius Toney, his best game is 8.8. He sucks this season. He could break out at any time, though. You never know with Kadarius Toney. Nothing impressive for Scantling. These guys aren't even getting a single game in double-digit points. They just all are just like these dusty, like scrubs. And, Kelsey's matchup, Kelsey doesn't have a great matchup, but he's the only guy really that Mahomes wants to throw to. On the Minnesota side, Hawkinson has a much better matchup. Hawkinson looks pretty good, like with the tight end getting 12.5 points versus Kansas City on average. Hawkinson last week, 3 targets only. The week before that, 11. Week before that, 8 and 9. So he's getting heavily targeted. 14.8 points in week 3, 25.6 points in week 2, and 11.5 in week 1. Those weeks where he had the big games were in high total matchups against Philadelphia and the Chargers. The lower total games against Carolina and Tampa Bay, he did nothing. So this is a type of week where Hawkinson shines. So look for Hawkinson to have a good game and to be in your player pool. Kansas City, Mahomes is the only guy I'm interested in on the Kansas City side. But Mahomes, what has he done with these scrubby receivers? He got 15 points against the Jets, who have a much better defense than Minnesota, obviously. 25 points against Chicago, 25 points against Jacksonville, 20 points against Detroit. Look for Patrick Mahomes to put up around that 25-point fantasy output against Minnesota here this week. Cousins, don't have as much faith in Cousins. Like it could be like the Chiefs take a lead and then, slow the game down or something like that. Hawkinson, the only guy, like with a really good matchup. Obviously, Justin Jefferson, you can use him in any matchup. Justin Jefferson, what's he been doing? He got 26.5 last week, 31 the week before that, 29 the week before that, 27 the week before that. So Justin Jefferson, I mean, you don't even need to tell me to play him. 9 targets, 13, and 12. So yeah, look for Justin Jefferson is going to be the key. If you're going to play Patrick Mahomes this week, you got to play Justin Jefferson, because the only way that Patrick Mahomes is going to have a decent game or continue to put up fantasy points against Minnesota is probably going to be if Justin Jefferson is going off. I like Hawkinson's matchup better than Kelsey's this week, and Hawkinson is a $1,100 discount. So, I mean, you could do, like a Mahomes, Hawkinson, and Jefferson type of stack. Don't even waste your time trying to figure out, who to pair Mahomes with. Kelsey, he's been underwhelming this year. Looks like age is catching up to him. 12 points last week, 20 points in week 3, 12 points in week 2. So Kelsey has not looked good. Hawkinson has looked better, and Hawkinson has the better matchup. So that is probably where I would be mainly looking to target in that game. But, with the potential for this game not to shoot out, be looking for some cheap stacks. We'll cover that in our cheap stacks show later on in the week. As far as the rest of it, hit the like button on this video, hit the subscribe. I'll have a breakdown of tomorrow's Thursday night matchup coming up Thursday morning at some point. So keep an eye out for that. It's the Bears versus who are the Bears playing? We got the Bears versus the Commanders tomorrow. That's a 44.5 point total. Washington are heavy favorites in that game for some reason, even though Chicago has a really good matchup. And Justin Fields started to show a little bit more life. They're giving him more designed run plays. So they're going back to last year's offense. Commanders have been playing well, but I like Justin Jefferson tomorrow. I mean, not Justin Fields tomorrow. So I'll give a breakdown of that game and get more into it tomorrow. So keep an eye out on that content. Subscribe to the YouTube page at Heatseeker Sports. Subscribe on Twitter at Heatseeker Sports, and I am at Pumacom on Twitter and or X, whatever you want to call it. And until then, I will see you guys tomorrow.